All right. Does that sound better? I think so. All right. So welcome to Marx 813. I'd like to begin with two epigraphs for today's seminar. The first, as I promised in my lengthy introduction to the readings that I posted online, I begin precisely where Marx leaves off in his article on the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. I begin then with the last paragraph, the concluding remarks. As you know, of course, the 18th Brumaire addresses the coup d'etat of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte on December 2, 1851, when, as president of the Second Republic, French Republic, facing a term limit in 1852, Louis Napoleon seizes power and extends his presidency for another term. He effectively grants himself another presidential term, this time of 10 years. And of course, a year later, day for day, he's declared emperor of the French under the name Louis Napoleon III. The passage, then, is the passage that ends the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, a striking passage to read today. Driven by the contradictory demands of his situation and keeping at the same time, like a conjurer, a performer, under the necessity of keeping the public gaze fixed on himself, as Napoleon's substitute, by springing constant surprises, that is to say, under the necessity of executing a coup d'etat en miniature every day. A coup d'etat en miniature every day. Bonaparte throws the entire bourgeois economy into confusion, violates everything that seemed inviolable to the revolution, makes some tolerant of revolution, others desirous of revolution, and produces actual anarchy in the name of order, while at the same time stripping its halo from the entire state machine. He profanes it and makes it at once loathsome and ridiculous. A passage that is eerily contemporary. It's hard to imagine something that might fit our times more exactly. The second epigraph is from Herbert Marcuse's book, Counterrevolution and Revolt, published in 1972 at the height of the Nixon administration and the repression of the Vietnam protests, the Black Power movement, following Kent State and the Jackson State massacres of 1970. He's working within the Marx and Engel's framework of counter-revolution, and he writes, "The Western world has reached a new stage of development. Now, the defense of the capitalist system requires the organization of counter-revolution at home and abroad. But," he says, "the counter-revolution is now largely preventive, and in the Western world altogether preventive. Here, there is no recent revolution to be undone, and there is none in the offing." Marcuse's brilliant insight, of course, is that there's an ongoing counter-revolution, but without really a revolution to suppress. These two epigraphs set the stage for our discussion tonight of two key texts of Marx and Engels that analyze, dissect, put under the microscope both the revolutions that erupted in Paris in February and June of 1848 and in Vienna and the German states in March of 1848 and 1849, as well as the massive, overwhelming counter-revolutions that followed, and for a while, at least, buried the revolutionary fervor of the Parisian and German workers. Now, given our political situation, we'll be reading those texts in conversation, not only with Marcuse's Counterrevolution and Revolt, but also in conversation with what is going on in the United States now, because we are witnessing today a new and radical offensive in the American counter-revolution. Now, the counter-revolution itself is not brand new, as Marcuse's text shows well, but we face a new offensive. We're in what I would call the demolition phase of this new offensive of the counter-revolution. President Trump is taking a bulldozer to the existing federal government, tearing down its foundations in an effort to eradicate the liberal regulatory state and replace it with an oligarchic oligarchic-theological, fealty-based culture of the leader regime with an authoritarian grip. He's carrying out the demolition phase under the banner of eradicating DEI, gender ideology, climate change consciousness, critical race theory, critical theory, and immigration. And he's using a small set of scapegoats to justify and motivate this new offensive, including immigrants, whether undocumented or not, on present or future work visas, transgender women especially, indocile African American and other persons of color, critical theorists, thinkers, and environmentalists. It's a counteroffensive of revolutionary scale, and it's been made possible by an unexpected alliance of forces of seemingly odd bedfellows, including tech billionaires, populist nationalists, evangelicals, rural voters, young tech bros, as well as fritting away at a traditionally democratic constituency, many union members, and now increasingly Black and Latino men. Trump is, like Louis Napoleon was, a source of fascination that constantly sucks up all the energy in the room. Trump, like Louis Napoleon did, knows how to get our attention every day. He is masterful at that. Like Louis Napoleon, he is executing a coup d'etat en miniature every day. And you'll recall his statement back to his aides in 2017 before taking office. Mr. Trump told top aides to think of each presidential day as an episode in a television show in which he vanquishes rivals. That described well the first presidency, but I think it describes even better the past 3 weeks. But this is not a story about Trump, nor about Louis Napoleon. As Marx emphasized in his preface to the second edition of the 18th Brumaire, written in 1869, the central thesis of his article, right, was to demonstrate that the rise of Napoleon III was the product of class struggles in France and not a great man's story. The famous sentence that encapsulates the argument is the one where Marx states that his objective in writing the articles was to demonstrate how the class struggle in France created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part. Now, we tend to emphasize the humor in that sentence, the idea of the grotesque mediocrity, at the expense of the theoretical thrust of the sentence. But the important point is that the entire account in the 18th Brumaire is a study of class struggles and how they played out, not about the rise of an individual, nor about Louis Napoleon himself. It's not a traditional great man story, not even the story of a grotesque mediocrity's rise to power. The engine of history is entirely the social conflicts, not the individual. Engels had argued the same in the articles on Germany, to show that the revolutions, as well as the counter-revolutions, in his word, were not the work of single individuals, but spontaneous, irresistible manifestations of national wants and necessities, more or less clearly understood, but very distinctly felt by numerous classes in every country. For Marx and Engels, the political project was to make people understand the larger forces at play so as not to be blindsided. Because the counter-revolutions of 1848 to 52 in Europe were international phenomena. They didn't just occur in Paris or France with Napoleon III, but in Vienna, in Baden, in Berlin, in Hungary, and elsewhere on the continent. And the new offensive of the counter-revolution in America here is not only happening here. Just last Saturday in Madrid, February 8, 2025, the extreme right leaders in Europe rallied at an event organized by the Patriots for Europe, the European Parliamentary Far-Right Bloc. These included, clockwise, from left, Marine Le Pen, of France's far-right National Rally, Santiago Abascal, the Spanish leader of the right-wing political party Vox, Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, the leader of Italy's League, Matteo Salvini, Netherlands populist Geert Wilders, and André Claro Ventura, the founder and the president of the right-wing populist Portuguese political party Chega, as well as a host of others not figured here, including Aphrodite Latinopoulou, a lawmaker with the Greek far-right party Voice of Reasons. And they were buoyed and supported by a huge audience of extreme right followers. These photographs are courtesy of Getty, Reuters, and the New York Times. In fact, the reunion was so far right that even right-wing leaders like Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy did not attend. As Orban said, yesterday we were the heretics. Now we are the mainstream. And of course, they were all united in attacking wokeism, gender theory, environmentalism, and immigration. According to a newspaper report in the New York Times, they skewered the liberal fascists, who they said had replaced Christian civilization with a sick, satanic utopia, the creeps who want to turn our children into trans freaks, and the supposed ethnic replacement of native-born Europeans by immigrants. And of course, we have upcoming elections in Germany in 2 weeks, on February 23rd, 25, because of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's lost vote of confidence, elections that portend another rise of the AfD. The lesson of Marx's 18th Brumaire and of Engel's Revolution and Counterrevolution in Germany may well be to shift the focus, as Marx said, from a grotesque mediocrity to the larger economic and political forces at play, the conflicts in society. So let's begin then by looking at those two texts. Marx and Engels were writing, of course, at the time of a counter-revolutionary consolidation across Europe. There had been revolutions. It's not an accident that the Tribune published Engels' articles on the title Germany, Revolution and Counter-Revolution, right? And the question, of course, was what explained the success of the counter-revolutions across Europe. That was the main question for Marx and Engels. That was the puzzle. What explains the counter-revolution? You can hear it well. They're feeling that they are at a moment of, they're between the first and the second act. They hoped there would be a second act. And they had to understand what had just happened, right? This is Engels. If then we have been beaten, we have nothing else to do but to begin again from the beginning. And fortunately, the probably very short interval of rest which is allowed us between the close of the first and the beginning of the second act of the movement gives us time for a very necessary piece of work, the study of the causes that necessitated both the late outbreak and its defeat, causes that are not to be sought for in the accidental efforts, talents, faults, errors, or treacheries of some of the leaders, but in the general social state and conditions of existence of each of the convulsed nations. So let's work with Marx and Engels, at least to derive a framework for our contemporary analysis. And I'd say that their writings give us several hypotheses to work with. First, the central place of class conflict nestled within modes of production. So as mentioned already, of course, that's the central thesis of both works. It rests on a detailed analysis of the classes and subgrouping within those classes. So it's not just the bourgeois and the proletariat anymore, as we had kind of gotten a whiff of in the Communist Manifesto. The bourgeois class itself is now divided, internally conflicted between the financial aristocracy, the financiers, the bankers, the industrialists and manufacturing bourgeois on the other hand, the large land-holding property owners in another, all separate and at odds with the petty bourgeoisie, consisting of shopkeepers and merchants, right? And also, there is a much more nuanced analysis of the proletariat class as well, with the emergence of the lumpen proletariat that the bourgeoisie would instrumentalize as a militia against the workers. In addition, there are the rural populations that take on a far greater importance and are divided and dissected into the peasants, the rural workers, the small property owners, the large farmers, right, who together form the vast majority of the French population. Engels does the same in his analysis of Germany, right? Include first the feudal nobility, which by contrast to France and to England retained most of its ancient privileges, still at mid-century. Engels then looks at the bourgeoisie associated with a somewhat backward manufacturing sector in Germany that had nevertheless started to form a commercial or middle class struggling for power and uniting in a kind of liberal opposition. Third, he studies the petty bourgeoisie made up of the small traders and shopkeeper class, which along with the workers and rural populations, formed the massive German states. Then he looks at the working class, which was delayed because of the lack of industrialization. They remained more like small tradesmen of the Middle Ages. They hadn't suffered that downward social nobility of the French workers that marked the beginning of the revolution. And then the rural populations. Engels divides it into 4 categories: the large and wealthy property owners, the small freeholders, the feudal tenants, the agricultural laborers, right? All of these represent the most important of the classes, but what characterizes the analysis here and with Marx is this minute kind of dissection of all the different segments of the population, all of which will be important to understand the success of the counter-revolution. And from that class analysis, then, we have the analysis of the conflicts. Now, of course, Engels reduces the central point to a great law of the motion of history, as he writes in the third edition in the preface to the 18th Brumaire. We can be somewhat less dogmatic, perhaps, less scientific than Engels was. But nevertheless, what he was proposes tracks pretty well the text. First, the law according to which all historical struggles are in fact only the more or less clear expression of struggles of social classes. Yes, we got that. The second point is that these social struggles, he writes, are in turn conditioned by the degree of development of their economic position, by the mode of their production and of their exchange, determined by it. So, second, the classes and the relations between the classes are determined by modes of production. This applies to all historical struggles, Engels suggests, whether they are political, religious, philosophical, or in some other ideological domain. Now, of course, we can criticize Engels for trying to render this far too scientific, but I think it effectively gets at the core of what Marx was trying to do in the 18th Brumaire. And so, of course, what it would call for today would be a close reading of social classes, a close reading of social conflicts within an understanding of the economic context and modes of production within which these conflicts play out. Third, the historical conjuncture. Counter-revolutionary offensives also arise within specific historical conjunctures. One gets a clear sense of this in another contemporaneous text, writing by Engels, called The Real Causes Why the French Proletarians Remained Comparatively Inactive in December Last, published in 1852. You get a good sense of it here. We repeat, he writes. I mean, he's writing in his own name, but of course he's corresponding daily with Marx. So, Louis Napoleon came to power because the open war carried on during the last 4 years between the different classes of French society had worn them out, had shattered their respective fighting armies, and because under such circumstances, for a time at least, the struggle of these classes can only be carried on in a peaceful and legal way, by competition, by trades organizations, but by all the different means of pacific struggle by which the opposition of class against class has now been carried on in England for above a century. Under these circumstances, it is in a manner of speaking in the interest of all contending classes that a so-called strong government should exist which might repress and keep down all those minor, local, and scattered outbreaks of open hostility, which, without leading to any result, trouble the development of the struggle in its new shape by retarding the recovery of strength for a new pitched battle. In other words, there was a sense in which the workers were worn out, dulled in part by a form of liberal hegemony, lulled into believing the peaceful coexistence of all those contending parties and factions, anesthetized in a way, complacent, believing too much, perhaps, in the rule of law, we might say. They had lost focus on the stakes of the conflict. Fourth, the place of culture and ideas. With Kendall Thomas, we were going to be focusing specifically on Stuart Hall's reading of the 18th Brumaire, which he considered to be the most vivid illustration of a style of analysis that he developed and which is known as British cultural studies. Hall's work focused on the emergence of different kinds of cultural forms, whether it's the youth in Great Britain or the Thatcherites at the turn of the 1980s. He approached Marx, more from his philosophical writings, especially the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, the more humanistic Marx, to focus on, as he said, to give a much wider reach to the elements of consciousness, to the question of human needs. And Hall, of course, argued that the task was to push Marx's analytic work from Capital towards the analysis of real cultural social formations. And he thought that the 18th Brumaire did that best. It was, quote, one of the best examples of how that kind of analysis could be done. So, of course, the attention then to the cultural wars at play, how Napoleon was able to play on the imagery and references associated with his uncle, for instance. Similarly, how the 1848 revolutionaries were hearkening back to the French Revolution of 1789. That's the famous opening of the 18th Brumaire, of course, right? From 1848 to 1851, only the ghost of the old revolution walked about, right? Caussidière for Danton, Louis Blanc for Robespierre, the Montaigne of 1848 to 1851 for the Montaigne of 1793, 1795, the nephew for the uncle, right? The way in which these symbols were being used as a way to captivate and to gain power. And then the fifth element, of course, would be with regard to the revolution in response to the counter-revolution. This was, in both works, the more uplifting side of the story, possibly, the silver linings. And here what both Marx and Engels argue throughout is that the revolutionary impulse develops a life of its own, in part in reaction to the repression of the counter-revolution. This is the silver lining of the counter-revolution, a form of optimism in Marx and Engels that has several elements. First, the idea that counter-revolutionary repression gives birth to the revolutionary forces themselves. Of course, he argued that the revolutionary proletariat only arise at a specific moment in history during industrialization, and it becomes a revolutionary force as a result of being crushed during the Bloody June days. So there are two stages here, but the second, of course, is the empowerment through repression. And the second, the counter-revolutionary repression, then turns the revolutionary forces into a permanent or long-lasting phenomena. This is the idea that the revolution lives on despite its demise. This was the idea in class struggles that we saw last time. The revolution is dead. Long live the revolution. It has gained an existence of its own. It has gained that second body. And of course, it's the famous passage in the 18th Brumaire where Marx predicts that the revolution will one day return from its still journeying through purgatory, and that, of course, Europe will leap to its seat and exultantly exclaim, "Well-grubbed old mole," right? This idea that it continues to exist despite all odds. And then third, the counter-revolutionary repression only strengthens the revolt. As Engel writes, every attempt at forcible repression will only bring it forth stronger and stronger until it bursts its fetters. And this suggests, of course, that the resistance can explode at points and seem absent at others, but it is burrowing underground until it resurfaces with élan. So what we can draw from these two texts, right, are the 5 points to explore today, guideposts perhaps to deal with the present, classes and class conflicts, the economic context, the historical context, the ideological or cultural context, and of course, the revolutionary response. Now, on the basis of these writings, of course, there developed theories of counter-revolution. Arno Mayer, for instance, developed, an analytic framework in dynamics of counter-revolution in Europe. Other thinkers as well, Walden Bellows, focused on counter-revolution and the global rise of the far right. Arno Mayer kind of set forth a framework with trying to come up with different types of counter-revolutions, whether they are preemptive or posterior or accessory or disguised or anticipatory, externally licensed, internally imposed. None of those categories actually fit very well today, in part because they describe more openly militaristic regimes, whereas we are dealing with a counter-revolution that takes the appearance, for now, of a civil democratic government. But there are certainly elements in here of the preventive, as Marcuse notes, of the anticipatory, although my sense is that there is not so much on the part of the counter-revolution a fear of revolution as there is really a consolidation of power and a veiled, perhaps real, possibility of pushing American democracy towards authoritarianism. So these writings are helpful, but I don't think that they take us away ultimately from the structure that we could develop based on the Marx and Engel reading tonight, which then takes us to the present and to the American counter-revolution. Now, as you know, the American counter-revolution has a long history. Of course, it traces its more recent iterations and genealogy to the War on Terror after September 11th, but it goes further back, of course, to the Reagan offensive in the 1980s, to J. Edgar Hoover's assault on the civil rights and the Black Panther movements before that. Perhaps it goes back centuries. Perhaps it goes back as well to W.E.B. Du Bois's, what he called the counter-revolution of property that we were speaking about with Gayatri Spivak, and that dealt the death knell to Reconstruction. In the book, The Counter-Revolution, I tried to trace its recent history, at least since 9/11, and to show how disparately, how apparently disparate practices in the U.S., like paramilitary policing of protesters, indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay, infiltration of American mosques, etc., all fit neatly within a model of governing based on the paradigm of a counter-revolutionary, counter-insurgency war. All of those offenses, all of those offensives since 9/11, I argued, flowed from the central strategy of counterinsurgency warfare, what was called unconventional, or in the lexicon of the French commanders who perfected this in Algeria, la guerre moderne, right? Modern counterinsurgency warfare has at its heart a three-pronged strategy. First, obtain total information on the population. Second, eradicate, decimate the active minority resistance, the internal enemy. And third, win the hearts and minds of the passive majority. And what I argued there, of course, was that the counterinsurgency warfare paradigm, right, has become our new governing paradigm in the United States, both abroad and at home. It has come to dominate our political imagination. It drives our foreign affairs and now our domestic policy as well. I emphasized, and with Marcuse, of course, that what was so striking about this counter-revolution, in effect, was that there was not a revolution that it was responding to, which resulted in kind of a radical result, right, of a counterinsurgency model in the absence of an insurgency or an uprising, or counter-revolution without a revolution, or what could simply be called the counter-revolution with a big C, being the idea that it's not responding to anything, it is its own entity. And I think that this is what we are seeing today. Differs sharply then from 1848, where there had been a revolution, and yet the moments are similar in the sense of the consolidation of power. And so what we're seeing today is a consolidation that is very similar. I need hardly recount the events since January 20th. I think we're all far too familiar with them. In the 3 weeks of President Trump's second presidency, he has signed radically expansive executive orders, multiple times more orders than any previous president, including himself in the first term, multiple times more executive orders. and obviously engaged in a wide-ranging midnight purges, threatened and harassed federal employees and agents, shuttered whole agency in a concerted battle plan to dismantle the federal government. He has set his sights on certain targets or scapegoats that include DEI and racial minorities, that include gender ideology and transgender and disabled persons, what he calls the Green New Deal, and climate change activism, and perhaps most draconianly, undocumented immigrants. I don't think I need to go over those. I think you are familiar with them all. It's important to understand, of course, that none of them, again, are unique to the United States, and none of them are unique to Trump. And that's one of the important, in the same way in which I was flashing pictures of the patriots in Europe. The whole notion of gender ideology has been floating around in Moscow, in Russia, right? Masha Gessen has been exposing this for years, but also in Poland, where they've styled gender ideology in the struggle over abortion. Guillaume Rouleau has been talking about that for years. Giorgia Meloni in 2019, why is the family an enemy? Why is the family so frightening? There's a single answer to all these questions, she says, because it defines us, because it defines our identity, because everything that defines us now is an enemy. Of course, Viktor Orban as well, inspired by Putin. In 2020, Orban held a referendum aimed at stopping gender insanity, that's a quote, and quote, restoring our common sense. Bolsonaro in Brazil, of course. And many years ago, right, when Judith Butler's was kind of, you know, burned in effigy, her image was burned in effigy. This has been going on for a long time at an international level. It's been floating around. We're seeing it here now. And the treatment and the crackdown on immigrants, of course, is not something that is unique to the United States. Although the idea of that we are now sending undocumented persons to Guantanamo perhaps reaches a kind of climax of brutality. So then, I'd like to start our conversation by proposing some of the ways in which these 5 factors could help us analyze, and then open it up to a conversation to kind of flesh these out as much as possible. And maybe I'll turn to you, Tom, when I'm ready to give up the mic. But I've been obsessing about these, of course. What are the classes then, to start there? What are the classes today, right? And is class the right way to think about it today? Well, if we were to use some of the schematics of Marx and Engels, I think we would have, starting with those who support the president, say, the tech billionaires. They represent, in some sense, the pinnacle of the feudal class. Their presence at the inauguration was simply remarkable, mingling, sitting next to sitting United States Supreme Court justices who have cases involving them, in front of them. Now, they had distanced themselves from Trump during the first presidency and often supported the Democrats, but have now torn into the Trump inner circle, even possibly deposing Trump at some point. The relationship with Musk, it's not clear anymore. He seems to be much more young and vigorous. The event yesterday, Trump really looked like an old man falling off of the table, and it was Musk who was taking over, it seems. So the tech billionaires, we'd have to also think of a cadre of other billionaire donors and benefactors, such as Timothy Mellon, Miriam Adelson, Linda McMahon, and others, right? So a strata of the extraordinarily wealthy. Then, of course, there's the older, wealthier strata of the established GOP, right, which for many years resisted Trump, or at first tried to resist, but has completely fallen in line But these I would consider a kind of a strata of kind of Brahmin of the old GOP. We could think of a strata of increasingly kind of young men in tech and startup industries who view themselves as anti-regulatory and entrepreneurial. There's, of course, another huge base, which would be the MAGA base, which would extend somewhere from what would have been called the petty bourgeoisie to the more economically marginalized persons. Those are the people who are represented in a way by Steve Bannon, who advocates for a form of populism and nationalism. A form of populism in the sense that he's claims to be representing the interests of middle-class Americans, the people, the ordinary Americans. This is what Bannon talks about, and he often talks about wanting to soak the rich. He has, in this sense, in this populist sense, he has an anti-elitist and anti-wealth discourse that is stunning. And of course, this is what makes for these very odd bedfellows, right? And then the nationalism, his nationalism, which is really part of this MAGA strata, couche, right? Is the opposition to globalism, right? Opposition to the idea of integrating the American economy into the global economy. Opposed to capitalist hiring of foreign labor, of immigrants, of H-1B1 visas, of bringing in anyone into the country to take away, supposedly, American jobs, right? Which he calls tech feudalism, right? A real sharp criticism of the tranche of tech billionaires. Then you have another couche of another strata of rural populations in this country. I think we could leave it at that term, maybe. The rural populations vote overwhelmingly for Trump and view themselves as the antithesis to urban elites and urban dwellers, view themselves as the protectors of family values. You have evangelicals and the moral majority that plays an important role here. You have also sets of white nationalists that we saw come out, for instance, at Charlottesville and elsewhere. And you have a new growing segment of, it seems, some black and Latino men who have been pulled away from the Democratic Party. If you go to the other side of the political spectrum and try and do some analysis of these different groupings, right, you have college-educated, urban liberals who are upper or middle class. And of course, you have black women and Latino women who form perhaps the most solid and loyal backbone of the Democratic Party. If you look at the election tallies, it's simply remarkable. Now, and in order to understand the consolidation of the counter-revolution, we would need to analyze then the conflicts between and within these classes, among others. Of course, we'd need a full analysis, but we'd also need to look at the conflicts within these classes. And I think that there are fascinating conflicts within these classes that exist. Of course, between the MAGA base and the tech billionaires, but even within these classes. And we saw one really sharp internal conflict, I think, that would be a perfect reflection of a Marx or Engels analysis. And the way it fueled the counter-revolution, which is having to do with the defund the police context. And there, you know, of course, huge social movement that developed after the George Floyd murder that encompassed a lot of different interests and classes. There emerged an abolitionist movement that included mostly black activists, members of the Black Lives Matter movement, liberal white progressives as well. The movement gained an enormous amount of traction and momentum. Many of the slogans and ideas that had been once radical became somewhat mainstream or commonplace. The idea of defunding the police became somewhat commonplace. In fact, polls showed that about a third of the American population was in favor of defunding the police, right? There were more and more posters, defund the NYPD. It was pretty remarkable. And some municipalities actually did defund the police in Minnesota. Now, once that movement began to be taken seriously, there was an enormous backlash by the right, of course, by the police and by the supporters. It started countering with Blue Lives Matter. Blue Lives Matter flags and stickers started to crop up in conservative and reactionary quarters, but pretty soon the centrist liberals and progressives who had been part of this coalition, right, and who had been part of this movement, broke off from the abolitionists and in a way joined the assault on the defund discourse. And so President Barack Obama in particular assailed the movement, saying that it had lost so much credibility when it embraced the theme of defunding the police, right? President Biden as well, he went on the offensive. And a large segment, as a result of, educated, centrist, middle class, broke with the, again, predominantly African-American abolitionists and protesters in a clearly demarcated way. This was an internal conflict, right, within groups who were working together. And supposedly they did this, the progressives, to protect the Democratic Party from the counter-revolutionary forces. Now what's interesting to realize, of course, is that those Democrats were playing into the hands of the counter-revolutionaries by beating up on the abolitionists. But the radical right wasn't doing that in a strange and inconsistent way, right? And so Marjorie Taylor Greene was talking about defunding the FBI, right? And there began a whole discourse about defunding federal law enforcement agencies. And of course, the January 6th rioters were really violent with the police, and they've been pardoned, right? Even those who violently attacked police officers. So the terrain itself was fractured in multiple ways. But what's clear is that once the abolition movement started to gain steam with a coalition of black activists and white progressives, there developed sharp conflicts within the left of the relationship to the police that played right into the hands of the counter-revolution. And today, of course, police unions and law enforcement are overwhelmingly conservative and located on the right politically. And order is synonymous with the counter-revolution, but today things are much more fragmented. There's much more room. And Marjorie Taylor Greene can continue to talk about defunding these institutions, and Trump is taking an axe to the FBI, right? And other institutions that were traditionally, conventionally in America associated with foreign intelligence, right? I mean, USAID was always very clearly associated with foreign intelligence, right? So what's fascinating is, and I think that that's a good example of the ways in which we would need to look at the kind of conflicts within these classes and these groupings. Okay, second, the economic context. So second, here, of course, we need a robust analysis of globalization, of neoliberalism, of finance capitalism, of the rise of artificial intelligence and what it's going to do to the economy and to jobs and to the number of jobs, particularly since the fall of the Iron Curtain. Marx's writings are undoubtedly outdated, which is understandable, but the emphasis on political economy is not. And I hope we're going to talk about that at this seminar. In the US context, overall, I think the major force here is a widespread perception that the middle class has been losing to the 1%, being evaporated, being gutted. I think that's what is and has fueled the Bannon MAGA movement. I mean, at the global level, you're all familiar with the, contested elephant graph, but many people, including Paul Krugman, interpret it as evidence of the detrimental effect of globalization. These are global income increases since 1988 to 2008, with a sharp no improvement for the 80, 85, 90 percentile, who many people associate as the lower and middle classes in Western countries. Okay, there's some controversy over the interpretation of the elephant graph, but if you put that aside and look only at the United States, there's ample evidence to support the perception that the middle class is falling behind, and certainly that it's in a worse position than it was since the Great Recession of 2008. So this is Pew research findings, which I still feel are can be pretty confidently relied on, but you could rely on Piketty's work as well, and others, right? The first graph, it's a greater share of the nation's aggregate income is now going to upper income households, and the share going to middle and lower income households is falling Falling, second graph, the wealth, that's the wealth gap among upper income families and middle and lower families. The wealthiest families are also the ones that have experienced the greatest gains. Fourth, at the aggregate level, median income is down since the Great Recession. So just imagine how bad it is for middle and lower classes, given the increasing inequalities. And of course, for the last 16 out of the 12, for the last 16 years, 12 of them have been under Democratic administrations, 8 years by Obama and 4 years by Biden. So how are these economic forces playing out? Well, there's a strong sense, at least among the MAGA base, that their lives are stagnating, that they're suffering from inflation, higher costs at the gas pump or groceries, whatever, and that's fueling a set of course, hateful ideas about replacement theory, hateful theories about white people are going to be replaced by immigrants and overseas workers, about hateful theories about a criminal invasion, which is fueling the idea that immigrants are criminals and need to be sent to Guantanamo, and of course hateful attacks on diversity and transgender people with blatantly racist and prejudiced language and cat whistles. So within the context of these broader economic shifts, which we need to look at, price gouging after COVID, inflation, and the technological changes of AI. Okay, the third area we would want to go explore would be the historical context. Remember that passage from Engels about the workers being worn out from the years of compromise. Here too, we'd need to explore whether the left was worn out in 2024 by years of unsuccessful attempts at impeachments, criminal prosecutions, whether there were a constellation of events here, an elderly president, Biden, the anointment of Kamala Harris without a democratic input, disbelief at the possibility of a second term. But we'd have to go higher, more abstract, because this is not just, again, this is not just happening in the US. We would need, I mean, we often talk about contagion, that Trump is fueling Le Pen or Meloni, but there were precursors to Trump too, right? So he fit in a series. There was Berlusconi in Italy, for instance, before, who had all of the trappings of Donald Trump and also came from the media. So again, we need to focus on the broader historical context and not singular leaders or cult personalities. Fourth, we would need to bring into the conversation questions from Stuart Hall, right, and retool our cultural studies. It feels as if material class interests are not maybe as important as they may have been in 1848. Somehow, culture is taking on a bigger role. Maybe it's because of the way that information is disseminated today. Fox News, for instance, in this country, Fox News, and of course, Fox News in this country, the same thing is happening in other countries, CNews in France, et cetera. I mean, the takeover of the media by reactionary or counter-revolutionary leaders is common in all of these spaces. But Fox News here in this country, it's incredible. I don't know how many of you watch Fox News. I was watching Fox News because I was in the ICE last Monday down at Federal Plaza in the where ICE was taking somebody in custody, and they had on the 9th floor of Federal Plaza, they've got rooms, and it's Fox that's showing on the television. So I really had to, so I had to, it's remarkable. And people can say this about other media as well, but it's not a form of news. It's a form of political. It's a pack. Fox is a pack at this point, and it has changed. It has changed. That, I mean, we can't understand the United States, I think, and these transformations without understanding, or without watching, and without understanding the way in which Fox News is shaping the way people think. And that's true of social media as well, of course, X, which has been cannibalized, Truth Social, all in the hands of the extreme right. So the sharing of information, politicization of news is something that we have to focus on as well. And its relationship, I think, and its relationship on Fox to sports, to football, to the fact that there's now a mass communication that changes things dramatically. Dramatically different than the way that information would have traveled in 1848 or even in 1980s, say. Okay. Now, and also, I think we need to focus on also other cultural trends or phenomena in the U.S. A general hatred of the or disregard for the government, for the establishment. Right, that's not necessarily the case in other countries, or as much in other countries, where the state is, in some countries, respected as an entity that plays an important function. In this country, I think it's fair to say that there is a general kind of in the water, anti-establishment, anti-government that runs deep. There's also boredom in this country and maybe in other countries as well. People like to see car crashes. This seems to be only amplified by social media today, right? There's an entertainment value, and of course that ties into the fact that Donald Trump is such a brilliant entertainer. And of course there always been attraction to authority figures in the US like elsewhere. Napoleon has always been an authority figure for France. The Roman emperors, you can go back as far as you want. It's important to remember that the United States kind of almost veered towards fascism in the 1930s. There was a strong pull. FDR was tempted. He flirted with Italian fascism. Ira Katznelson has written a lot about that. And many of these leaders are very audacious. Engel's remarks, of course, that a revolution requires audacity, or, as he writes, in the words of Danton, the greatest master of revolutionary policy yet known, de l'audace, encore de l'audace. Well, that applies as well, of course, to the counter-revolutionaries. And the leaders of these counter-revolutionaries sweeping the world stage have audacity, far more, it seems, than those who have been trying to stop them. I think Obama's audacity of hope pales in comparison to what Trump has been doing with executive orders in the first 3 weeks of his presidency. And we might even only imagine how far this audacity might lead. In his commercial real estate dealings, Trump has used bankruptcy to avoid debt obligations and start again, right? Might he be thinking about bankrupting the U.S. to wipe out our massive $36 trillion debt and start from scratch again? Is that even conceivable? Has it crossed his mind? This is, after all, how he built his commercial real estate empire. Who knows what shape it's in, but by using bankruptcy laws pretty effectively. All right, so preliminary assessment, and then maybe I'll turn it over. I think the place to start, again, with Marx and Engels, is to understand that President Trump is a reality TV star with a talent for creating daily episodes that draws the entire world's attention. He's immensely talented at that. But he's only the symptom of much larger forces. Steve Bannon tells a fascinating story. It's in the New York Times in an interview with Ross Douthat, that he identified Donald Trump as the perfect spokesperson for Bannon's populist nationalist views, the views that he had developed on Breitbart. He actually identified Donald Trump at a political rally in Hanover, New Hampshire in May of 2014. It's a fascinating account. And Bannon was there with Breitbart Radio, listening to Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, Newt Gingrich. The cattle call is what he calls it. And then he hears this guy called Donald Trump. And these are his words. Trump came up and just starts. It was like Mort Saul. He's just talking today's headlines and just riffing on it. But in riffing on it and talking about the border and jobs in China, people were leaning forward in their seats. And I recall later and told Miller and Sessions and others, I said, this is our guy. I said, if this guy is serious about this, we can do this. This guy is the personification of what we need. He's a hammer. He's a man's man. And if he's serious, which at the time that was a big question, I always thought he was serious. Big question, though, right? Bannon, of course, was channeling the Tea Party populism at the time. And he would throw his entire weight behind Trump. And of course, Trump would reciprocate with his own populism and nationalism, bringing with him, of course, elements of white nationalism, which is always adjacent to nationalism. But this nationalist populism would cannibalize the white working class union members and traditional working class Democratic voters, the exact populations that Bernie Sanders would have been able to attract had he not been crushed by the neoliberal left. Bannon talks a lot about wanting to soak the rich, but of course Trump was able to form an alliance with the wealthiest billionaires and now the tech billionaires. And these extremely wealthy people, we call them oligarchs when they're in Russia, understand well that it's in their financial interest to dismantle the federal regulatory state. They understand well that the term deregulation, which is a euphemism for re-regulation, works in their financial interests. The resulting social conflicts pit the extremely wealthy and national populace, as well as the rural population and extremists like white nationalists and militias, against the urban dwellers and minorities. And all of this is taking place within the broader context of macroeconomic shifts, globalization, AI developments, etc. And insofar as the most resolute bloc of democratic voters and abolitionists and protesters are Black and Latina women, and secondarily Black and Latino men, the conflicts, the social conflicts, take on a racial dimension, which in part is what explains the attack on DEI, critical race theory, the AP program, African American Studies, etc. There had been a centrist Democratic Republican consensus, a form of peaceful cohabitation and alternation that benefited the old elites in the United States. It was manifested by the neoliberal or the Washington consensus that prevailed in the 1990s and 2000s. It was an Ivy League consensus among old family dynasties like the Kennedys and the Bushes, when that had been completely upended. Now, it has been completely upended by a new set of billionaires. And the wild card, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think, is a reflection of those tectonic shifts. The billionaires today in the MAGA base want to dismantle the federal regulatory state to reduce it to its barest bones, which means military and police spending primarily, and of course, federal enforcement of the traditional family and a racial order. This takes us, of course, to the fifth and final piece of the framework that we could look at, which is the revolutionary response. And I think I'll leave that open for our conversation. Marx and Engels were adamant that the counter-revolution only fuels a revolution, that the old mold is perhaps burrowing, but will come out to the surface again. What could that mean? How will that happen? I'll just make one note that for some reason today I was surprised to get wind of a TikTok video by Anonymous. I hadn't heard of them. I hadn't been thinking about them, where they hadn't been crossing my path for years. In fact, Tom, I think it was during all the Occupy Wall Street that we were most kind of in conversation or thinking about Anonymous. But just today, kind of like was the first time that they reappeared and resurfaced. And in, of course, one of their remarkable performances, talking about the cracks that are being, the cracks in the foundation that are happening because of the kind of attack on the federal agencies and et cetera, that can and will, they say, be breached. I don't know, but the question becomes, what is that old mole going to look like? Okay, so with that, let me open it up for us to have a conversation. I kind of tried to set out 5 dimensions that we can talk about. I don't know, it might not make sense to take them each separately, but I'd love to hear where we can go with this conversation and with this analysis. So, you want to kick it off?
Sure.
All right. I'm going to ask Tom Mitchell, W.J.T. Mitchell, greatest critical theorist from the University of Chicago, founder of Critical Inquiry, and a longtime friend, co-author, kind of, right?
Yeah.
Something like that?
Yes,
and
we co-authored Occupy,
Yeah.
yes, kind of with Michael Taussig from
Yeah.
Anthropology, an analysis of the Occupy movement. I was just thinking, when your epigraphs, if I'd chosen 2 quotations to kick this off, one, they would have been from Marcuse. I think I'm probably the only person in this room who was a student in 1968. Anybody else here? Yes, I thought, okay. Few survivors, yes. That was the year I graduated from Johns Hopkins. And so it's uncanny to me to walk into Columbia University today and to see the security. It's not as bad at University of Chicago. I can tell you it's much harder to lock down our campus. And of course, we were reading Marcuse as, you know, this was huge news. And his analysis of the class division among the student movement at that time was very, I felt completely caught between it, because there were the long hairs, the hippies, and there were the political Puritans, as he called them. So Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers on one side, SDS, and Jerry Rubin and the yippies, so forth. Is this image a revival of that? I don't know. That image freaks me out. I don't want to get too close to it. The other epigraph would have been this, a moment when Marcuse says in 1972, it's not fascism yet. Remember, he says it's a counter-revolution, but it's not fascism because the liberal state and the media are holding fast. Walter Cronkite is still telling us that's the way it is every night, and there is a national consensus about the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let
me give you the
Yeah.
quote, okay? So he writes, this is on page 24 of Counterrevolution and Revolt. He says, "This is not a fascist regime by any means," he says. "The court still upholds the freedom of the press,"
Yeah.
right? Exactly that. And there's these 2 other great passages right there. Were you going to talk about them?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, particularly when he says there will be a moment when there will be a democratic election that will produce a fascist regime.
Right.
That democracy itself is we think of democracy as an antithetical to fascism. Actually, fascism is a stage in constitutional democracy. It's when the Constitution is shattered. It's the moment we're in. I firmly feel this is what American fascism looks like. It's showing its true face now. It is a hydra-headed creation, and Bernard has laid out the many, many heads of it.
This is just such a great line. It's on page 25 of Counter-Revolution and Revolt, where he writes, and he's citing William Shirer of Los Angeles, "We may well be the first people to go fascist by the democratic vote."
Well, we the second, because Hitler was elected, as you all know. So elections are, you know, one of the symbolic tropes of democracy, but it's not actually existing democracy in my view. The other thing is just this one line, and maybe you can find this one too, Bernard, where he reflects on Kent State. Remember when the students were shot, and the mother of a student who is there, a mother from Kentucky, says they should have shot all of them. Those long hairs with their bare feet and their dirty clothes. In other words, my generation of students, they should all be shot. We need to clean this country up. So I think the question of, everybody wants to know what is to be done, everything, and you have Michelle Obama saying, do something. Yeah, thanks a lot. I think I wish I could remember where this quotation comes from, but in the darkest moment when the old mole has gone so deep that he may never reappear, you need to study, study, study. The idea that running out to the barricades, or the other thing, you must be getting cascaded as I am with hundreds of emails in which here's how you can act and send money, that's it. Hundreds of organizations that are trying to raise money on this moment of despair, and especially the Democratic Party, which is not getting a nickel from me. Because alongside everything else they did, forget about the tactical mistakes, but the specter of the Democratic Party administering a genocide in this last year that is not over. In fact, on Saturday, we've been told the genocide will resume. Of course, it's continued even during this ceasefire. People have nothing to eat, nowhere to sleep. So that's the kind of international byproduct of this moment. One other thing just to say about Trump as the clown prince. I think it was last night or the night before, on Jon Oliver came and had a triumphal moment of welcoming the United States back to monarchy, saying, you know, you had your revolution, and now we want to welcome you back. You've finally come to your senses, and you have a king. All is forgiven, except we want to be paid back for the tea. So one way I cope is watching comedy every night. Since there is no common news, one thing you'll find that is common is comedy. It's a great place. Satire, and if you read Marx word for word, you know, a fantastic satirist. As a literature professor, I always teach him as a prose stylist as much as a political theorist. Trump is not just a reality TV star. That's his technical skill. But what specific figure has he cut? To me, it is the figure, it's as old as the American frontier, the idea of the outlaw hero. You notice that every time he breaks a law, that is a moment of heroic transgression. He raised money on every indictment. He turned the tables on the U.S. justice system. The next move on the chessboard is when the Supreme Court tells him, yes, you actually do have to obey a court order. And J.D. Vance has already said it for us. I'm invoking the precedent of Andrew Jackson. You can make your ruling. Now, please try to enforce it. He's already ignoring the orders, we know that. But he hasn't publicly stated yet, I defy your orders. If you don't rule the way I like, I'll get other judges. So this is the real thing, guys. It's I feel kind of privileged to have lived long enough to see the moment that Herbert Marcuse predicted in 1972. I don't feel lucky to do it, but here we are. And yeah, welcome to our world.
Thanks, Tom. All right, who's going to jump in now? We got multiple dimensions that we can explore. Some of the larger economic forces that are shaping this counter-revolution across the world, right? Different questions about the classes and the class conflicts, the historical context, the cultural context, the unique cultural ways in which this is playing out. Who wants to jump in next? There are 2 seats that over here, so
Can I say one more thing?
yeah, please do.
While everybody's gathering their thoughts. One of the stupidest things I think was said about the 2024 election was James Carville repeating what sounds almost like a Marxist slogan when he said, "It's the economy, stupid." And I want to say, no, it's not the economy, stupid. It's the stupidity. Really, an undereducated population that has been subjected to the new media, and Bernard brought this up, the change in the media sphere of this time is not just about Fox. It's also about scrolling and trolling and podcasting and the niche marketing of the disaffected around conspiracy theories, so that there is no commons, no media commons whatsoever, except I think maybe comedy, fortunately. And driven by, and this is where the tech bros come in, by algorithms that measure affective attention, and so clicks are money. How many clicks you get, and how much time you stay on and keep on scrolling. That attention economy it goes to the lower sections of the brain, the limbic system. Doesn't go to the frontal lobes. It activates anger, fear, anxiety, paranoia, and this was known by the ancient theorists of rhetoric. You want to get attention? Elevated thoughts don't make it. Get to the fear. Get to the hatred. That's what generates attention.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to pass it to Kendall Thomas. So, bring you the mic, Kendall.
Hello, everyone. I really don't have much at all to say, except that I'm very glad to be here for this important conversation and for the political practice in which, whether we realize it or not, we're all engaged, which is the work of study, a practice which I think it's important to note has quite literally been criminalized in this country, and whose criminalization began with Black thought, right? And with the study specifically of the politics of anti-Black racism and the politics of white supremacy. We, sadly, given the extent to which we ourselves, whatever our political commitments, are in the grips of some version of the liberal fantasy, find it very difficult to admit that that is our reality. And since the situation is so riven by contradiction, on the one hand, CRT and DEI and woke are fascist, right, or anti-Semitic. On the other, we are at a university which just a few months ago, certified a PhD program in African American and African diasporic studies. And so the contradictions of social class that Bernard was talking about, it seems to me, are contradictions that characterize the institution in which we find ourselves and the very practice of knowledge. I would concur completely with what W.J.T. Mitchell has just said about the epidemic, one might even call it a pandemic, of illiteracy that characterizes life in these United States and life globally. There's a sort of celebration of, and yet a kind of contempt for illiteracy and the illiterate. I always start, and here I want to take, not so much take issue as part company with Bernard on the question of whether or not we are currently living in the age of Trump, in the same way that Edward Said said in 1982 that this was manifestly the age of Reagan. Angela Davis, in her correspondence with George Jackson, points out that fascism actually has characterized the lived experience of black and brown people in this country for most of the modern era, right? Our relationship to, certainly that of working and poor black and brown people, has been a relationship in which the government has practiced on our bodies and in our communities and our homes the incipient fascism, which is now taking open, expressed form in the current moment. And Davis, who was taught by Marcuse, uses Marcuse's notion of preventative fascism, right, in her correspondence with Jackson. But it occurs to me that one reason for holding on to, if only as a heuristic, this notion, again, with a gesture toward Edward, that the current moment is the age of Trump, is that, and again, this was so rich in your setting the terms of the conversation, Bernard, is this idea that we're living in a moment of a kind of performative fascism, right? In which we are quite literally, what was a Neil Postman title of some decades ago? Politics has been colonized and cannibalized by a politics of entertainment, I'm tempted to say of a certain kind of enjoyment, of which Donald Trump is the embodied expression, right? This guy enjoys himself, right? And the performativity of the fascism, I think, has to be seen as a supplement, a distinctively American supplement to Marcuse's observation, which you mentioned, that democracy, that fascism in the United States would be ushered in through democratic form, right, through electoral forms. Because this marriage of the electoral system and the corporate, industrial, entertainment media system, I think, is a uniquely American contribution. I mean, if you look historically, what the United States has given globally to the world is our particular form of culture industry. And the last thing I would say then is that I think I value enormously the rhetorics of revolution and counter-revolution, but I think we also need to understand or could understand, we need to understand something about this moment that is captured in a supplemental way by a term that's related to revolution, but which, and I'm going to be talking about this later in the month at the Trilling lecture, something that needs to be supplemented by an idea that Horkheimer and Adorno developed in Dialectic of Enlightenment, namely this notion of regression, right? And the ways in which the technological progress, the cultural progress, right? The narrative of the 20th century and of the American century in particular, as a moment in which we have seen in real time that in every day and in every way things are getting more and more better, was always an enlightenment that contained the seeds of its own regressive erasure, right? Of the purge, the great erasure, as Masha Gessen would call it, that we're living through in this moment. Now, what does that mean for the final point, the fifth point at which you left us and opened this question of the ways in which revolution and the revolutionary spirit will find itself rising from the ashes, as it were? I think one thing to hold on to is the ways in which we are also at a university which paradoxically represents, for its historic moment, a kind of revolutionary principle, right? This institution, and if we look at the history of this institution, I'm thinking of 68 here, we look at the history of this institution, this was an institution that was once styled, that its name was King's College, and we cut off the king's head, right? Now, we still hold on to the iconography and symbolism and the institutional brand of the crown. It's on our business cards at the law school, right? And I think that's our yearning, the sort of the yearning for a kind of authoritarianism, right? That is sat alongside and survived this moment of independence. But I want to hope against hope, right? And I say this as someone who is still mourning the tragedy that we have lived through as a community over these past few months, which hit me in a particular way on January 9th when the dean of our law school sent us an announcement about the accelerated retirement. I mean, we're in an Orwellian world. The accelerated retirement of our colleague, Catherine Franke. I want to hold out the hope that the work we're doing here tonight is faithful, right, to the revolutionary spirit that animated the cutting off of the king's head that took place when the decision was made that this institution would no longer be called King's College. And to invoke what for me is my favorite maxim in this moment of thoughtlessness and the celebration by Trump of illiteracy, because everything he does is about trafficking in illiteracy. Two quotes. One would be Frederick Douglass. Education and slavery are incompatible. And the second one would be Marcuse, who once wrote that the restoration of remembrance to its rightful place is one of the noblest tasks of thought. And that's what we're doing here, it seems to me, this evening.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kendall. So, let me just say something. I think I'm just trying to turn off the sound.
It's very intense. See everyone's voice from a few minutes ago. Split second.
Okay. All right. So who wants to jump in? Daniel?
So the New York Times described Kamala Harris as pitching a Wall Street endorsed economic plan. It fell flat with the voters. And I think part of what we need to do is look at the class basis for neoliberalism. The MSNBC folks who talk about the flyover states, the contempt for the working class that was part of the democratic elite, corporate-backed, Reid Hoffman, who wanted to get rid of Lena Khan, who also were anti-regulation, that, a lot of what Trump did was accelerate the assault on the state, end welfare as we know it, the crime bill. It's not the case that the assault on the state is unique to the Republican Party. And it's just, again, this ambivalence about state regulation, because as you've always pointed out, they're the regulations they want and the regulations that they don't want. But the anti-statism, and there's an irrationality to the anti-statism, which has to do with, capitalists like Musk being high on their own supply, where they don't acknowledge the role of the state in capitalist accumulation and in consumption. And the part that I think we often separate, and Marcuse talks about this, is emotionality, sensuality was Marcuse's term, from the economic. That, you talked about the difficulty of linking Trumpism to a single class moment because classes are fractured. But nevertheless, Marcuse was offering us an alternative in the book. And that is, in art, in sensual freedom, that what everyone has in common is a universal that might be realized in imagination, but everyone's particular experience of domination and exploitation separates them. And part of what I guess I wanted to ask is, how do we link the Stuart Hall and the cultural realm to the particular class fracturing and the different assaults on different populations and the emotional compensation that many people have for their class subjugation, which is what Trump is offering the white working class people to hate, people to kick. Because is he really promising them economic advancement? I don't think so. I don't think they even believe that. I just think they feel good that he's punishing the people that they imagine themselves to be punished by, and that the state is seen as a displaced figure, displacement of capital, where it's the state that's extracting wealth. It's welfare and black people who are stealing our wages, and it's the Mexican rapist and the trans person, that there's all this anxiety and uncertainty, all that solid melts into air. We're in that moment now, and what Marcuse also talks about is nostalgia, right? And the return to a sort of imagined past. And I think part of Trump's mastery is to take people who all feel a sense of anxiety, including, the upper middle class feels anxiety, right? Which side are you going to be on? Which side is the professoriate going to be on? Are they going to be the winners or the losers? And what everyone has in common who embraces Trumpism is a way of managing their anxiety by a return to an imaginary past. And what do we have to offer in its place? What Marcuse talks about as sort of a universal imagination, a universal sensuality. But for many people on the left, we have a utopophobia. That the revolutions have failed. We're just constantly Nancy Reaganite left, just saying no to what is. And right now in this moment, if all we do is say no and resist without offering an alternative, we're in big trouble.
Yeah, that's for sure. And the questions of alternatives and what alternatives, or having a positive vision, right, seems key right now. Mickey Sawyer, Hunter College.
Hi. So I spent last year in Frankfurt, and I watched it all unfold from a distance from Germany. And I thought was really interesting, for me, what was really interesting, and I talked about it with other Germans, is that we all felt like the Americans don't take it seriously. They don't take the democracy seriously. They think that it's indestructible because they've had it for so long, right? And then And then that like the left, or also some of my colleagues, are just, everyone talks about revolution and is like really vocal about it. And it's almost like as if this individualistic, it's an expression of individualism. I'm a revolutionary, I'm doing this, now is the time. And then it's like, okay, and now what? And so in Germany, on the other hand, and again, I have no solutions, but it was an interesting observation. So the campus in Frankfurt was quiet. There was nothing. It was so peaceful. Like it was just absolutely quiet. And that sort of captured like the sort of, I think, the shock in which Germany is right now, where we will have a right-wing party again. And, probably, I don't know, like everyone claims not in power, but soon. And so everyone is just quiet. And I went to this was like last fall, I went to a demonstration, and I felt like I was in this time machine, right? Like it was a demonstration against the right. And it was me and my friends that have been there 30 years ago as well. And it was just like quiet. There was no urgency, right? Like, and while in the US, everyone is very noisy and everyone is on Twitter, in Germany, everyone is just quiet. And they look at the upcoming election, they're like, oh God, there's really nothing we can do. And so I don't know. It seems like I'm caught between these two worlds, and nothing is really. I am kind of hopeless because I don't know what has to be done. Maybe the stakes are still not high enough. Maybe we are still doing too well, right? Like maybe we are still too comfortable to actually do something, to get off Twitter, and like, I don't know, or we are too scared.
Yeah, well, I think that there is some fear that is circulating in terms of trying to avoid, avoid notice. I think that that's something that's going on right now. But I take it that the study. I mean, these are the texts that try to find the silver lining, right? I mean, these texts are written at moments like this of complete crushing, right, of revolutionary fervor. I mean, actually, for someone like, for Engels, we're talking literally being on the barracks and fighting and being defeated, but thinking that there was going to be something that would come out of these revolutions, right? In other words, so these are texts that are written by people who, Marx and Engels, who must have felt at a few moments that actually they were realizing the revolution that they were hoping for. But these texts are written at a moment where it's totally crushed, and of course, yet they are trying to excavate. Through an analysis of the class and the economics, they're trying to excavate kind of what would be the path forward, or how it would surface. Hassan, do you want to jump in? You got to push the thing up.
Hello, is this working?
Yeah.
Revolution and counter-revolution. In many ways, I suppose I'm echoing your point earlier about this is not unique to the US. This comes to mind for current grotesque mediocrity, referring to another dictator in Egypt, Sisi, as his favorite dictator. In many ways, I am a child of a revolution, 2011 specifically, and I came of age during an actual counter-revolution in the presence of a revolutionary event. And I suppose my question, we keep speaking of revolution and counter-revolution and so forth, but what can the sign of revolution today truly be an adequate discursive way of assessing contemporary struggle? I mean, can we situate the heterogeneity of contemporary struggles within the formal process of revolutionary morphology? And by revolutionary morphology, I mean a revolution in the classic sense of a word, designating a global struggle involving classes as unitary entities, a struggle guaranteeing total liberation, overturning an established power from top to bottom, which by its historical necessity subordinates all other struggles. I mean, to me, this discourse of revolution is somewhat a relic of Western Marxism. I mean, can the sign of revolution today truly monopolize, as it did in earlier historical epochs, the decentered struggles of the 21st century? And it's a question, it's an open question. I'm inviting people to think through this question with me. I mean, we refer to texts within the Western Marxist tradition, but I think we should stretch this tradition. I mean, we should speak of authors and thinkers outside sort of these traditions within the contemporary moment. And I suppose that this is a bit of returning back to Professor Mitchell's comment on satire. There's a bit of squeamishness among my comrades here regarding the counter-revolution. But to many, I mean, many peoples in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, they've been living the counter-revolution for decades, maybe even more than decades.
Yeah, right. So thanks for bringing that up. And in fact, this is styled as a counter-revolution without a revolution. I mean, the question of revolution has, throughout the late 20th century been ambiguated and displaced in a way. The modern concept of revolution is that classic idea of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, et cetera. And we've had some great earlier discussions at previous 1313s, particularly surrounding Koselleck's writings about the way in which kind of the notion of revolution is no longer really a contemporary, or no longer a contemporary paradigm that functions, and has been replaced by notions of insurrection, notions of uprisings, notions of occupations, notion of riots. So all of that is, all of that is to say that I'm not sure anyone is invoking the modern concept of revolution, either here or at this time, in part because the concept itself gave way to these other forms of revolt. And so a lot of critical thinkers deploy those other ways of thinking. Joshua Clover talks about, riot, strike, riot, the different ways in which, today we're in a moment where rioting, a form of rioting, is more likely to be activated. And that the Arab Spring in 2011 was not considered a revolution, but forms of uprisings, etc. Now that then raises the question of the efficacy or the value of these different forms of uprising in the contemporary context.
If I may,
yeah,
just interject. I don't think within at least Arabic that people didn't perceive 2011 as a revolution, at least within the Egyptian context, because people did use the word sawra, which means revolution, and they also used the word tahrir, which in Arabic means to liberate, but it also has a really similar, etymologically similar word structure as the word to write. tahrir, to liberate, to write, to create new forms of discourse. And I suppose, and this sort of haunted, this ghost of revolution truly haunted the imagination of a lot of people in that moment. Sort of echoing the 18th Brumaire, the ghosts of the past haunt us like a nightmare and so forth. So I suppose my question, at least my invocation, that when we do speak of radical politics, how do we go about it today, as opposed to going back to Marx and searching for an answer within Marx, as if this is the Bible. This oeuvre will give us the answers and so on and so forth. But what are the solutions today that we need to think about? What new forms of discourse, new forms of tahrir, liberation, or new forms of writing discourse, which we can utilize today in the struggle? And this is an open question. I don't quite know the answer. I don't really have any poetic flourish to conclude these invocations.
Yes. Can you, Hassan, can you pass the mic back?
Hello. First, I just wanted to point out, like this irony of last time we did 713, we read Engel's in his introduction, talking about how the democratic way is the way to go in revolution in the modern times. And today, hearing Tom Mitchell say that that fascism is sort of the next form of democracy. And that's a contradiction that I'm yet to make sense of in my head, in case anybody could speak to that. But in terms of what you were talking about right now, and I know that the basis of this seminar is a counter-revolution without a revolution, but I was thinking of the fact that I disagree with that, and I may want to open our thoughts on, do we think that we have been in a revolution? Across the world, we've had authoritarians coming to power, we've had fascism, and I can speak to India, where we've had several social movements try to rise up. We've had very successful ones, like say the farmers' movement or the CA movement, some which have been repressed. But because, I mean, Marx does call he calls the second French Revolution from like 1848, he calls it farcical. He says that it's trying to mimic the first revolution. But why? Like, why are we requiring revolutions to mean a certain, what standard do they have to meet in order to be called revolution? Why isn't the college protest that happened over here, protests that erupted all over the world for Palestine, for Sudan? Yesterday there was a protest against the Trump administration's anti-trans policies. There were protests all over the world, including the US, when Trump won the elections. So why aren't these considered the revolution? Clearly what is happening is a counter-revolution. Clearly what's happening with Trump is a response to DEI, to all of these institutional ways in which society has created forms of recognizing minorities, of trying to create equality. Why isn't it a revolution, is, I think, my question.
Thanks. I certainly won't try to attempt to answer that question or to answer definitively what a revolution consists of, but I think maybe one interjection that might expand the conversation a little bit is to ask what constitutes a revolutionary subject. And one thing that I drew from the reading for this week, and something that we were talking about at the end of our session last week, is whether to take people's word at whether or not they are sort of revolutionary. So in discussing January 6th, where most of the people who stormed the Capitol considered themselves revolutionaries in the sort of make of the "don't tread on me" resistance, whether or not we should consider those people who, more than half of them were white-collar workers, small business owners, whether we should consider them revolutionaries. And something that I turn to is Arendt discussing the mob or the mass. It comes up a little bit in the 18th Brumaire, where Marx describes the mass and the mob as the offal, the refuse, the scum of all classes.
Do you have the passage? Is it when he's talking about the lumpen proletariat, or?
It's in chapter part 5. So I'm not sure if it's in the reader, but it's I'll find it. It's in part 5, maybe the 3rd or 4th paragraph. Yes, the lumpen proletariat. Yes, he's discussing them, who recognize in the scum, offal refuse of all classes, the only class on which he can base himself. This is discussing Bonaparte rising to power again. Arendt describes them as the déclassés of all classes, the sort of the character of the people, not actually the people themselves. And I guess what I sort of wonder is how we make sense of the mob as a sort of political set, as a social set, when it seems like that might be one of the points of fractures on the right now between the sort of populist mob, the people, the Elon Musk acolytes, those on X who sort of see themselves as these dispossessed, disenfranchised group with a very real class interest, and these sort of technocratic and real movers and shakers of the political world.
Yeah. I want to jump in. So on the question of the lumpen proletariat, I find it very interesting that Marx, but also not only in the 18th Brumaire, but in the class struggles, is so down on the lumpen proletariat. And it's something that I think that there are other thinkers who have done more interesting work with that potential. And I'm thinking particularly of the Black Panthers or Huey Newton, of thinking the potential of the space of illegalities as a productive space of resistance and revolution. Now, on the question of revolution, I think one of the reasons that people hesitate with that word is because it seems so demanding, which I think is why people have turned instead to think about other forms of resistance, and used other ways of thinking about resistance, through whether it's occupations or political disobedience or riots, etc. I mean, in part, it's because I take it it's a very demanding standard to require a complete transformation of society, right? It's easier to imagine the toppling of political regimes, which is what Marx referred to as the bourgeois revolution. I mean, getting rid of a monarchy. But it's harder to imagine a successful kind of entire transformation of society, which goes with the idea of a revolution. I think in part that's why people turn instead to other forms of action that can have a lot of transformative effect, but doesn't have such a high threshold to achieve or something like that, right? I think that's what was behind, like, Occupy Wall Street as an occupation of space. And it might be a strategic question. Yeah, it might be a strategic question, right?
Yeah.
One thing, I'm glad to hear everybody sort of raising the question, you know, this romantic stereotype of revolution, of the total upheaval and the arrival of the utopian condition of socialism, classless society. It does seem like a dream. It was certainly a dream for the '68 generation I was part of. But I think Marx is also, one lesson we can learn from him is the idea of conditions. Revolutions, people can make history, but not under conditions of their own making. But how do conditions get made? And what are conditions for the possibility? And what about intermediate steps? There's also a political phenomenon known as restoration. I think over the next 4 years, the best this country can hope for is a restoration of constitutional democracy. You know, sounds like a pretty modest goal, but when you don't have it, it's really hard to get it back. So I think of myself as a former revolutionary. Right now, I would be content to see the rule of law. And another thing that I've overcome since my 68 days is that this concept of the deep state as the enemy, the idea that bureaucracy is the enemy, I know emotionally it's very hard to get over it, but could it be that in a large-scale society, a polity, you cannot function without a bureaucracy? That it might be absolutely essential. This is why the communist revolution in China has evolved now into what we might call a corporate state with a massive bureaucracy. Sometimes does good things, sometimes does terrible things. And one of the conditions going forward over the next 4 years is going to be that a wild card we have no control over, and that is China. You know, it's been designated as the great enemy. At the same time, Trump is talking out of the other side of his mouth that, you know, we don't want any wars. I'm sure at this moment the Chinese government is looking at Taiwan and saying, isn't this the moment? A nice peaceful takeover of Taiwan. So ideas of revolution, I think, are way on the back burner for me. Restoration is going to be my goal over the next 4 years. I can see some people want to really disagree with this, and so maybe this will provoke something.
Thanks, thanks. We do have, okay, let's go to Kendall, who's here, and then we're going to go to we're going to go on the Zoom, because we have a bunch of questions on Zoom, but we're going to have one from Michael Sukov, if we can get all the technology to work. But let me get you the mic first, Kendall.
So just very quickly on this question of a revolution, I'm with James Baldwin here, or I can use James Baldwin, who famously said that love is not a noun but a verb. I prefer to think of revolution not as a noun but as a verb, as a practice. And so, and Bernard, this is for you. I think it's worth asking, let's go back to last year and ask ourselves if we can think of concrete revolution, right? along the same lines that we were talking last year about concrete utopia. One book that I've been coming back to again and again in the last, well, since it was published, is Alberto Toscano's book on late fascism. And I was referencing him without citing him earlier when I was talking about the correspondence between Angela Davis and George Jackson. And they use the experience, as I said earlier, of people of African descent and the relationship to the racial state as an instance of a fascism that is foundational, right, to the American state. That is to say, which is not in opposition to, but in some ways is the predicate of this very rule of law democracy that we want to restore, which has always been riven by contradiction from the point of view of the lived experience of the people who have been left off the scales of the democratic justice that this constitutional rule of law regime purports to secure, right? And so that means that this constitutional citizenship, even after the 14th Amendment, has been a racial citizenship. And that what black people in this country have represented is a democratic principle against the racial republic, whose basic design was secured by the Constitution that we, I think, would be that we want to defend, whose idea we want to defend, but whose institutional elements we would have to reform in a revolutionary sense. But that's another conversation. What I want to say is, I'm just reading here from Toscano. This is Toscano. Angela Davis, develops a Marcusean thesis that fascism is a preventive counter-revolution to the socialist transformation of society, specifying that transformation from the vantage point of the lived experience of racialized communities in the United States. And here's the payoff. For the state, the most threatening feature of black revolutionary politics takes the form not so much of the armed struggle invoked by Jackson, what we typically think of as revolution, but of the survival programs, the enclaves of autonomous social reproduction practiced by the Black Panthers and other militant and activist groups. What can be gleaned from Davis's account more broadly are the differential visibility and experience of both fascism and democracy. In this regard, it can help to attune us to the ways in which race and gender alongside class can also determine the modality in which fascism is lived. So these concrete utopian moments of cooperism that Bernard has so richly theorized for us are practices, right, in which revolution is not a noun, but a verb. And I'm wondering, Bernard, can we wed the idea of cooperism or take the idea of cooperism as a module or building block for thinking about a practice of revolution outside of Marx, right? But which is about the lived, imminent possibilities of another kind of society for which models exist, right? And on which we can draw, which is what you spent the whole of last year helping us do.
Thanks, Kendall. So, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the idea of concrete utopias, of forms of cooperation, serve in a way as an alternative model to think of how to transform society, or is a model of the fact that there are within society today existing kind of transformative models that exist and can be amplified and can be worked with. And, you know, its relationship to Marx is complex, contested, and we dealt with that last year as well. Although, you know, there are certainly ways in which, if you take a more flexible perspective to social transformation, how it's going to occur, if you think about the ways in which Engels changes his views about the likelihood of revolution or democratic processes, etc., that it can be in conversation with. I mean, I think it's important, Hassan, you mentioned looking at these texts like the Bible, that certainly that's not the project here. We are reading these texts, so we engage with them, but at no point do we treat them like the Bible, I take it. The question is, what can we mine from them? What can we find that's useful in a positive, constructive way, right? I mean, it's easy to trash texts, but the idea here is to reread these texts in order to see what we can do, how we can reread, redeploy, etc. And I think that, I mean, one of the ways that I've tried to do it is, yes, through existing models of cooperation and trying to draw on the relations to thoughts that were very much critiqued by Marx. He was a big critic of, certainly of national workshops, less a critic of worker cooperatives that are actually founded by the workers, etc. But still a critic of that because he felt it was too embedded in market mechanisms. But I mean, if you really are hoping to transform society and deal with the hurdles of, you know, revolution, or the high hurdles of revolution, then, I mean, one way forward is to try and work from those models that have democratic self-governance in them, which are the values, I take it, the values of solidarity, the values of democratic and community, and democratic self-governance, which is at the core of a lot of these writings. But to build on those institutions or those ways of living, which also, by contrast to a social revolution, doesn't require the revolution to take place. And to take place, you can have these transformative practices on the way to a transformative state, which is something I think that, you know, thinkers in the wake of Marx, even Lenin, seemed to reevaluate and think about in 1923 when he wrote his 2 essays on cooperation. So I mean, but I think that these are all the kind of the key questions. We did have someone we wanted to try to bring in. I don't know if it's going to be possible. Let's see. We've got folks on Zoom who wanted to also, and then maybe we'll wrap it up after that. Michael Sukoff. Okay, it's a delay. We've got a delay. Michael, are you there? Can you jump in? Turn on your video. Yeah?
Hello?
Hello. Yes.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Great. I can't hear anybody else, so should I just speak?
Yes. Yes. Hit yes.
I'm waiting for a response in the chat. Oh, go for it, okay. Hello everyone, I'm really enjoying this conversation. I've been part of earlier conversations, well I haven't been part of them, but I've been watching and listening. So I'll be very brief. My original question I will take second, but I just wanted to comment briefly on this notion of revolution. I think making a distinction between radical and revolutionary would be helpful, and this comes from my work on Marcuse. I've been working on Marcuse for many years. I'm working on a book about his ideas right now. So Marcuse used the both terms revolutionary subjectivity and radical subjectivity. He used those terms interchangeably. However, he also used the term revolution in his writings, and there he was talking about an actual revolution, whether you consider it as a noun or a verb. But the notion of radical in Marcuse understood the term radical in the way Marx did. It meant going to the root of things. So I think we can look at a lot of these political protests that have been going on around Palestine, Gaza, whatever else you want to mention, as definitely either radical or having radical potential, but they're not yet revolutionary in a more global sense that I think Marx and Marcuse were referring to it. So I wanted to offer that. I don't know if anybody besides Ricardo has read my written comment in the chat, but I'll just quickly recapitulate that. And I've been a radio journalist as well as a critical theorist and a teacher. And what I've observed, especially over the last few years, there is a lot of critique on the left, radical left. I have hesitations about even using the terms left and right anymore for reasons I won't go into. But there are many people on the radical left, theorists particularly, and some of my colleagues, and probably many of you on this in this seminar right now. I don't like Fox News. I think they're extremely ideological. But I think what gets missed a lot by those of us who are critical theorists is the extent to which the kinds of so-called news that is propagated on the neoliberal corporate mass media outlets like CNN and MSNBC is also very much propagandistic in the sense that they're either actively or by omission promulgating sort of a mainstream Democratic Party-oriented version of the news. I don't even think it's news anymore. And in doing so, they are somewhat and maybe even equally complicit in reinforcing the ideological divisions in U.S. public discourse today. I could say a lot more, but I'm going to stop there in the interest of time. So I'd be interested in Bernard and Chom or anybody else who wants to comment on anything I've said. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think that maybe what we can do is we can end on that distinction, I think, between radical and revolutionary, which is, I think, a terrific way to end the discussion. I'd like to think that what we are doing with critical theory is the radical move of trying to uproot the roots, to find the roots, to go to the roots, right? And in part, that's what I think we have been doing in this conversation, building, I take it, on particular insights that you can mine and you can find the roots of in Marx's 18th Brumaire and Engel's Revolution and Counterrevolution. So I certainly think that that is a model of what we're doing, which in part is the return to study. And then, as distinguished from revolution, I think we'll just leave that one open. I can understand the desire and to return to that term and to that formulation. And I can also understand the ways in which people have gravitated towards other concepts as a way to try and make headway. In a way, cooperation, I think, is one such concept. But other forms of political disobedience, occupation that we've seen. And I think that it's probably the case right now that everybody in this room, I think so many people in the United States are trying to figure out this question, right? What it's going to look like. What the counter to the counter-revolution is going to look like. And I have no doubt that the old mole is going to be popping out of its hole very soon. Very soon. And with that, I think we can end this seminar. And thank you all. Thanks, Ricardo. And thanks, Reno, for all the AV work. Next week, we are, so on the 19th, Wednesday the 19th, Sheila Ben Habib is going to give us an extraordinary keynote lecture on Hannah Arendt's reading of Marx, okay? So it's going to be Sheila Ben Habib, who is, as you know, one of the world's leading readers, student, experts of Hannah Arendt. She'll be talking about Hannah Arendt's reading of Marx, and for personal reasons, she's going to be doing it on Zoom, okay? So I think we might as well all be on Zoom rather than being kind of disoriented looking at a speaker. So we can regroup next week on Zoom, 6:15, with Sheila Ben Habib for a keynote speech. Okay? Thank you. Oh, and of course, drinks.